There is a veteran named Brian Selby who once applied for a postage stamp. Not for himself, but for the men he served with, and for the ones who did not come home. He wanted 37.5 millimeters by 26 millimeters of commemorative paper, a sticky-backed philatelic acknowledgement of what he and approximately 3,000 other Australians did in the jungles of Borneo in the 1960s. Australia Post rejected the application. The 50-year anniversary had passed, they said. The next eligible anniversary would not arrive until 2066. Selby's response to that rejection is the most precise summary of this story that exists. He said the Indonesian Confrontation is one of only 2 post-World War campaigns Australia has been involved with that were complete successes. Not 1 inch of territory was lost, and no one knows about it. Tell me in the comments whether you have heard of the Malayan Emergency or the Indonesian Confrontation before today. What follows is the story of 2 jungle wars that Australia fought for Britain, won completely, kept secret for decades, and then used to justify a catastrophe. It is a story about what happens when a country wins quietly, forgets deliberately, and learns the wrong lesson from its own silence. On the 16th of June, 1948, 3 European plantation managers were killed on rubber estates in Malaya. 2 days later, the British colonial administration declared a state of emergency. The Malayan National Liberation Army, the military arm of the Malayan Communist Party, had launched an insurgency that would last 12 years, consume 11,000 lives, and cost the British Empire a sum that it could, at that point in its history, barely afford to pay. The word emergency was chosen deliberately. London-based insurers would not pay out on losses incurred in civil wars. Britain was fighting a war and called it something else because of what the word war would have cost in insurance premiums. This is not a minor bureaucratic footnote. It is the first piece of structural dishonesty in a story built from structural dishonesty, and it established the template for everything that followed. The veterans who fought in that conflict would spend the next several decades attempting to have the word warlike applied to their service. They would not succeed until 1995, which is 35 years after the fighting stopped. What the conflict was actually about, in the estimation of Britain's own Foreign Office, was documented in a classified file that said the war against bandits is very much a war in defense of the rubber industry. The Colonial Secretary Arthur Creech Jones had said it plainly in 1948. Serious interference with Malayan exports would gravely worsen the whole dollar balance of the sterling area. Britain dispatched its military to Malaya to protect commercial interests. The hearts and minds rhetoric came later, after the commercial reasoning had already determined the commitment. The economics came first. They always come first. The enemy Britain was fighting had a particular history. The Malayan National Liberation Army drew its membership almost entirely from the Chinese community, approximately 94% of its fighters, in a country where the Malay majority had been granted political and economic privileges unavailable to the Chinese. The Chinese community in Malaya had arrived mostly as labor for the rubber estates and tin mines, had been permitted to work but not to own, had been included in the economic machinery of the colony and excluded from its political structure. By 1948, a generation of young Chinese Malayan men had accumulated sufficient grievance to sustain an armed insurgency, and they had something more useful than grievance. They had training. The MNLA at its peak never numbered more than 8,000 fighters. That number is important. It means Britain deployed an ultimately overwhelming force against a comparatively tiny enemy. It did not win quickly. The disproportion between the size of the forces involved and the length of time the fighting lasted is itself a statement about the terrain, the method, and the knowledge that the MNLA possessed and the British initially did not. Those 8,000 fighters had been armed and trained by the British during the Japanese occupation to resist the invaders, and had spent years in the Malayan jungle learning exactly how to operate in terrain that British soldiers from the home counties found close to impassable. The insurgency that began in June of 1948 was, in its tactical foundations, the product of British instruction applied against the instructor. In April of 1950, General Sir Harold Briggs was appointed Director of Operations in Malaya and produced the plan that bore his name. The Briggs Plan addressed the MNLA's fundamental vulnerability. It depended on Chinese squatter communities on the jungle fringes for food, intelligence, and recruits. Remove the communities from the guerrillas' reach, and the guerrillas would starve or be forced to expose themselves in seeking supplies. Briggs proposed to sever that dependency by relocating the squatters. Approximately 1 million civilians were moved into fortified settlements that the British called new villages. These settlements were surrounded by barbed wire, police posts, and floodlit perimeters designed to prevent contact between the inhabitants and the guerrillas the inhabitants had been sustaining. The plan worked. The category accurate under the strategic assessment was not accurate about the human cost. Field Marshal Sir Gerald Templer arrived as High Commissioner in 1952 and coined the phrase that has since defined the campaign in public memory. The answer, he said, lies not in pouring more troops into the jungle, but in the hearts and minds of the people. Templer administered the 1 million civilian relocation system at the same time he coined the phrase. Both things were his policy. Neither canceled the other. The commemorative culture around the emergency has dwelt extensively on the phrase, and rather less on the system. This pattern of selective emphasis is itself part of the story. Britain also became, during the emergency, the first nation in history to use herbicides as a military weapon. The compound was called trioxone. Its chemical composition was virtually identical to what the United States would later deploy in Vietnam under a different name. Trioxone was sprayed along roads and on food crops to deny the guerrillas cover and sustenance. This is in the record. It appears in almost none of the public commemorative accounts of the emergency. Australia entered the conflict through its Air Force. In April of 1950, Britain asked Prime Minister Robert Menzies whether RF units could be sent to Malaya. Menzies hesitated. He was, by every available account, profoundly pro-British by temperament and political conviction. But he was also managing a domestic political situation that made open-ended military commitments complicated, and he was being asked to commit Australian military assets to a conflict that Britain refused to name as a conflict. He eventually said yes, with conditions and delays. In June of 1950, Dakota transports of No. 38 Squadron and Lincoln bombers of No. 1 Squadron arrived in Singapore. The Lincolns became the backbone of aerial operations over the Malayan jungle. They flew bombing sorties against suspected guerrilla concentrations in the deep jungle. The nature of that task is worth pausing on. Aircraft dropping ordnance onto jungle canopy so dense the aircrew could not see what was below. In July of 1954, 5 RAF Lincolns and 6 RAF aircraft executed simultaneous strikes on 2 communist camps east of Ipoh in Perak State, followed by paratroop drops and a ground assault in what was called Operation Termite. It was one of the emergency's notable military successes. It was also a demonstration that air power over dense jungle canopy always eventually provides. You needed someone on the ground who understood what they were walking into. By October of 1955, the commitment had grown to require land forces. The 2nd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, arrived in Penang, crossed to the mainland, and began operations in Perak and Kedah alongside British and Gurkha units. Their record was mixed. Contacts with the enemy were rare in the areas they patrolled. In June of 1956, during what became known as the Pipeline Ambush, 3 Australians were killed. It was the battalion's most significant action, and it was a defeat. The battalion served until October of 1957 and was replaced. What replaced it was a different proposition entirely. The 3rd Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, arrived in Malaya in October of 1957 to begin what would become one of the most operationally effective battalion tours of the entire emergency. 6 weeks of training in Johor, then Perak and Kedah, the same country the previous battalion had patrolled without decisive result, and a systematically different outcome. The method was food denial, not primarily to kill, though killing followed when the intelligence was right, but to starve. Patrols designed to locate and destroy the supply lines connecting jungle-based MNLA units to the communities that fed them. Patient work, unglamorous work, work that produced no dramatic single engagement and no headlines, but that was steadily and measurably effective. The approach was patient, exhausting, and in the specific conditions of the Perak jungle in the late 1950s, exactly right. The battalion had understood something that the terrain required, that in a jungle war against a small and mobile enemy, the decisive advantage belongs to the side that controls the food, not the side that brings the most firepower. Acting on intelligence from a surrendered communist in July of 1958, sections of the battalion located and destroyed several local guerrilla camps. The intelligence was the product of the patient relationship building that the battalion had been conducting for months in the areas it patrolled. On the 20th of November, 1958, the battalion attacked another camp in an action that produced the most striking specific discovery of the Australian involvement in the emergency. Among the guerrillas killed was a man subsequently identified as having participated in the assassination of British High Commissioner Sir Henry Gurney in October of 1951. Gurney had been ambushed on the road to Fraser's Hill and killed in his car. The operation had been the MNLA's most significant act of political violence, the killing of Britain's most senior representative in Malaya. The man responsible had spent 7 years in the jungle. He was killed by an Australian soldier in a camp in Perak. The record notes this. It does not underline it. In April of 1959, the British authorities announced that the state of Perak was secure. One of the MNLA's main centers of operation cleared. The battalion had been in Malaya for 18 months. The state of Perak was declared secure. That is what 18 months of patient, intelligence-driven, food denial patrolling had produced in a region that the previous Australian battalion had patrolled without decisive engagement. The 3rd Battalion left Malaya in October of 1959 and was replaced by the 1st Battalion, which conducted patrols in northern Malaya through the emergency's final phase, was forbidden to pursue communist fighters into Thailand, even when their precise presence and location were known, and made no contact with the enemy across its entire tour. The same army, the same general theater, the same period. One battalion cleared a state, the other made no contact. The distinction is in the record without commentary, which is where the commentary belongs. The emergency was declared over on the 31st of July, 1960. 39 Australians had died. The MNLA had not been destroyed. It had crossed into Thailand, where remnants of the organization would persist for nearly 3 more decades. What had been achieved was sufficient security for the political transition to proceed, a victory of a particular kind, partial, hard-won, and invisible to most of the population of the country that had achieved it. Australian forces remained in Malaya for another 3 years. The region, meanwhile, was producing something new and considerably more dangerous. Malayan independence came in 1957 and created a political geography that Britain had not fully resolved before granting it. By the early 1960s, Britain was preparing to grant independence to Singapore, Sarawak, and North Borneo. Malayan Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman proposed that these territories federate with Malaya to form the nation of Malaysia. Britain supported the proposal. The Malayan government was pro-British, and the alternatives, independent small states with significant Chinese communist populations sitting at the edge of the Cold War's Southeast Asian theater, were strategically alarming in ways that made support for federation an easy calculation. The proposal had its own logic. Indonesia's first president did not agree with the logic. Sukarno was born on the 6th of June, 1901, and had spent his political career binding an extraordinarily diverse archipelago nation together through the force of nationalism and his own personal authority. He saw the proposed Federation of Malaysia as what he called nekolim, neo-colonialism and imperialism, a British attempt to maintain dominance behind the mask of independence granted to its former possessions. He was not entirely wrong about the British motivations. Britain did want to maintain influence in the region. It did want a friendly and pliable government on the Malayan Peninsula. Sukarno's critique of the Federation's political architecture had a genuine analytical foundation and reflected a view of British imperial behavior that the historical record substantially supports. He did not, however, intend to accept a new state on Indonesia's northern border, aligned with his former colonizers, and he had the means and the will to resist it. The island of Borneo was, in 1961, divided between four entities. The southern two-thirds were Indonesian Kalimantan. The northwestern third comprised the British territories of Sarawak, Brunei, and North Borneo. The border between them ran for approximately 970 miles of mountainous jungle terrain. There were almost no effective roads for most of its length. There was no meaningful government presence on either side of it for hundreds of miles at a stretch. The primary rainforest through which the border ran reduced visibility to yards within meters of the tree line. The terrain featured steep ridges and ravines that did not appear on maps drawn from aerial survey, and numerous rivers that required crossing at every stage of any patrol. An attacking force could have entered Malaysian territory at almost any point along that border and been gone before any conventional defensive force had located where it had crossed. In December of 1962, Sukarno's government backed an attempted coup in the pro-British Sultanate of Brunei in North Borneo. British and Gurkha soldiers who arrived from Singapore suppressed the revolt within days. But its signal was unmistakable to anyone who understood what Indonesian opposition to the Federation actually meant in operational terms. One British officer read that signal with complete clarity. General Sir Walter Collier Walker was born on the 11th of November, 1912, on a tea plantation in Cuttack, India, one of four sons of a military family. He was educated at Blundell's School in Devon, commissioned from Sandhurst in 1933 into the 1st 8th Gurkha Rifles in Quetta, and survived the earthquake that destroyed much of that city in 1935. He fought the Japanese through the Assam battles and the Imphal campaign of 1944, commanded the 4th 8th Gurkhas across the Irrawaddy River in 1945, in some of the hardest fighting of the Burma campaign, and instilled in his soldiers the battalion motto that defined his own approach to military service: live hard, fight hard, and when necessary, die hard. He then built a second career as the British Army's foremost expert on jungle warfare, training British units arriving in Malaya at the Far East Land Forces Training Center in Johor, commanding Gurkha battalions through the emergency, and finishing his Malayan service by destroying the last 100 communist fighters operating in Johor State in 1958 in a sustained operation that concluded the emergency in that region. Walker was appointed Director of Borneo Operations on the 19th of December, 1962. He looked at 970 miles of jungle frontier and understood immediately what it required: a static garrison defense of a border that long handed the initiative entirely to whoever chose to cross it. The Indonesians could select the time and place of every engagement. The Commonwealth forces, positioned defensively on the Malaysian side, could only react. Walker had spent 30 years learning that in jungle warfare, the side that reacts is the side that loses. The only answer was to cross first. That answer had a name, but the name would not come for some months yet. First came Konfrontasi. In January of 1963, Indonesian Foreign Minister Dr. Subandrio announced that Indonesia would pursue a policy of confrontation. The terminology was chosen with care. Konfrontasi implied violence and sustained pressure without requiring a declaration of war, which would have triggered international legal obligations that neither side wanted to formalize. Indonesia wanted to destabilize the Federation. It did not want to provide the British with a legal basis for an unlimited military response. On the 16th of September, 1963, the Federation of Malaysia was formally proclaimed, incorporating Malaya, Singapore, Sarawak, and North Borneo. 9 days later, Sukarno declared publicly that he would gobble Malaysia raw. When the United States, alarmed by the prospect of a British military conflict with Indonesia, threatened to withdraw its aid program unless the fighting stopped, Sukarno replied that the Americans could go to hell. Australia watched all of this from a carefully maintained diplomatic distance. The Australian government in the early 1960s occupied a position of almost engineered discomfort. It wanted Malaysia to succeed as a stable, pro-Western state. It was acutely aware that Indonesia shared a long and essentially indefensible border with Australian-administered Papua New Guinea, and that antagonizing Sukarno might produce consequences along that border that Australia was not equipped to manage. Britain and Malaysia made repeated requests for Australian ground forces to be committed to Borneo throughout 1963 and 1964. Each request was declined. Australia provided training, supplies, and 2 small naval vessels for patrol duties. It agreed that its battalions stationed in Malaysia could be used in the event that Indonesia attacked the Malay Peninsula directly. This last commitment was made in the comfortable calculation that Sukarno would not be willing to trigger a direct attack on the peninsula, because a direct attack would be an obvious escalation that might draw in responses from parties beyond Britain and Malaysia. Sukarno decided the calculation was wrong. In September and October of 1964, Indonesian forces launched paratroop and amphibious raids against Labas and Pontian on the southwestern coast of the Malay Peninsula. They were the first Indonesian attacks on territory where Australian forces were explicitly positioned to respond. The 3rd Battalion, then based at Camp Tarandak in Malacca, was deployed in the cleanup operations. 50 Indonesian troops who had come ashore near Labas were rounded up with Australian assistance, many captured, and the remainder scattered or killed. The operations themselves were not tactically difficult. The Indonesian raiders were lightly equipped, poorly supported, and quickly isolated. What the landings established, beyond their immediate military outcome, was that Sukarno was prepared to escalate the conflict to whatever level was required to achieve his political objectives, and that the calculation which had sustained Australia's 2 years of refusals had been answered by events on the ground. In January of 1965, the Australian Cabinet approved the deployment of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, and the 1st Squadron of the Special Air Service Regiment to Borneo. The decision was framed publicly as a response to the changed military situation. It was also, unmistakably, the end result of 2 years of British pressure that the Australian government had resisted until it could not resist any further. It was, though no official statement acknowledged it in these terms, the last time Australia would commit combat forces to fight in a British military operation. the era in which Australian governments responded to British requests for military assistance as a near-automatic expression of the imperial relationship was ending. This deployment was its final act. The conditions attached to the deployment were not published because the most significant of them could not be published. The battalion and the SAS were going to participate in Operation Claret. Claret was the code name for a program of cross-border operations by Commonwealth forces into Indonesian Kalimantan. Walker had recognized from the campaign's earliest months that a purely defensive posture on the Malaysian side of the border surrendered the operational initiative entirely and permanently. His solution was to cross the border first, with small patrols, on specific intelligence, targeting Indonesian supply routes and staging areas, then withdrawing before any evidence of Commonwealth presence could be confirmed. Official public policy held that Commonwealth troops would not enter Indonesian territory. The official public policy was false. Both things were simultaneously maintained by the same governments in the same official documents, and the deniability that made this possible rested entirely on the Indonesians' inability to prove that the border had been crossed, because no prisoners would be taken, no dead would be left, and no operation would be acknowledged. The Claret rules were absolute and enforced at the highest command level. Every operation required personal authorization from the Director of Borneo Operations. Only experienced troops could participate, initially Gurkha units, British SAS, and the Special Boat Service, and from those only men who had completed at least one previous tour in Borneo. The penetration depth into Indonesian territory was strictly controlled. 2,000 yards in the earliest operations, extended to 10,000 yards by January of 1965, and eventually to 20,000 yards for SAS units operating on specific long-range intelligence missions. Soldiers were ordered to take no prisoners and to become none. No Australian dead were to be left behind. No Indonesian dead were to be left in a position that indicated where the ambush had been set. The enemy mustn't be able to prove that the border had been crossed. The secrecy extended downward through the chain of command in ways that are, in retrospect, almost extraordinary in their thoroughness. Men from the 3rd Battalion conducting Claret operations were not permitted to discuss what they had done with soldiers from other platoons in the same battalion. This was not a general instruction to exercise discretion. It was a specific operational order that created a compartmentalization so complete that knowledge of what one platoon had done did not reach the platoon that had done the same thing 3 days earlier or 3 days later. When researchers interviewed veterans in the 1990s, after the Secrets Act had expired and the official history was finally being written, men said the same thing independently of each other, with the certainty of men who had carried a private knowledge for 3 decades. We were the only platoon that went over the border. Every platoon said it. Every platoon had crossed. Visiting parliamentary delegations were shown maps of Australian troop dispositions, in which Australian forces remained permanently on the Malaysian side of the border. The maps had been constructed to show that. Only the Prime Minister and the Minister for Defence knew the full picture. Into this structure, in March of 1965, the 3rd Battalion arrived at Bau in western Sarawak and relieved a Gurkha unit on the frontier. The jungle that received them imposed its own orientation before any operational instruction could. Vegetation in Borneo's primary rainforest limits visibility to yards within minutes of entering the tree line. The canopy overhead is complete enough to make daylight navigation by sun position impossible. Steep ridges and ravines that do not appear on any map drawn from aerial survey appear underfoot without warning. Rivers require crossing at every stage of any patrol into the interior, and the rivers of Borneo range from fast and cold in the highlands to wide and brackish and inhabited by saltwater crocodiles as they approach the coast. Endemic diseases operate as a constant and unavoidable tax on physical capability, compounding daily. Malaria in its various forms, dengue fever, leptospirosis carried in the water, the skin infections collectively called jungle rot that attack every minor wound in an environment where minor wounds are produced constantly and treatment is difficult by definition. Patrols into Indonesian territory carried 7 to 10 days of rations because resupply was impossible, and any evidence of extended occupation would compromise the deniability the operations depended on. The fauna, finally, was not a minor operational consideration. On the 2nd of June, 1965, Lance Corporal Paul Dinhe of the 1st SAS Squadron became the first member of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment to die on active service. He was not killed by Indonesian soldiers, or by disease, or by the river crossings, or by any of the conventional hazards of a jungle war. A rogue elephant inflicted a tusk wound, from which Dinhe died over several days of unimaginable pain, without evacuation, in the Bornean jungle. He was the SASR's first operational fatality, the regiment that would later become known as Phantoms of the Jungle, that would earn a reputation across Vietnam, East Timor, Iraq, and Afghanistan as one of the world's most capable special operations forces, lost its first man to an elephant. Of the 23 Australians who died in the confrontation, 6 or 7 were killed in direct combat with Indonesian forces. The rivers, diseases, accidents of terrain, and the wildlife of a jungle that was entirely indifferent to the military objectives of the people moving through it accounted for the rest. The 3 Australians killed during the 3rd Battalion's Borneo tour were killed by Indonesian landmines, not by direct fire. The battalion conducted 32 Claret operations in 4 months. The Indonesian 440 Battalion was the primary opposing force in the Western Sarawak sector. Contacts were infrequent because the Claret method depended on surprise, and surprise required a patience that most military operations do not demand from infantry soldiers. You moved slowly through terrain that punished movement. You waited in positions that the jungle made uncomfortable in every direction. When you found the right ground, you waited longer still. The ambush position along the Sungai Coemba River was identified through weeks of intelligence work and careful observation of Indonesian supply patterns. Major Ivor Hodgkinson commanded C Company of the 3rd Battalion. By March of 1965, he was operating on a frontier that required the systematic accumulation of intelligence before any Claret operation could be proposed for authorization, mapping the border terrain in detail, establishing the rhythm of Indonesian movement through the sector, identifying the supply routes and river crossings that the Indonesian 440 Battalion was using to move men and materiel northward. His company's area of operations included the Sungai Coemba, a river running through Kalimantan that had become one of the primary arteries for Indonesian logistical movement toward the western Sarawak border. On the 27th of May, 1965, 2 platoons from B Company, 3rd Battalion, moved into their ambush position along the Sungai Coemba. They were approximately 10,000 yards inside Indonesia. They were not there. The record says otherwise. The Indonesian force appeared on the river, and the ambush was sprung. Significant Indonesian casualties. No Australians lost. The action was clean, controlled, and completely invisible. It entered no Australian newspaper, triggered no official statement, generated no ceremony, and no recognition. It was, in every accounting of the war that the Australian public was permitted to encounter, simply not there. The Indonesians were not passive recipients of this treatment. An intelligence assessment produced after the May engagement noted that subsequent observations of the Sungai Coemba had identified boats carrying men who presented themselves as civilians, but who scanned the riverbanks with a focused, systematic alertness inconsistent with the behavior of ordinary river traffic. Indonesian reconnaissance in civilian clothing, watching for the markers of a Commonwealth ambush position. The operational contest was not one-sided. Hodgkinson moved the next operation downstream, to ground the Indonesians had not been watching in the same way. On the 10th of June, 1965, he left the company base at Sarakan with 7 platoon under Lieutenant Robert Guest, an intelligence officer, and a fire control party. The patrol was designated Operation Fawn Fair. The ambush site was on the Sungai Coemba, further downstream than the May position, closer to the Indonesian staging area at Siding. The patrol occupied its position before dawn on the 11th of June and waited through the day. 2 boats carrying civilians appeared on the river and were observed and allowed to pass. The patrol held its position through the night. On the 12th of June, the Indonesian force arrived on the river. The ambush was sprung. Heavy Indonesian casualties. No Australians lost. Across both engagements at Sungai Coemba, approximately 31 Indonesians were killed. 2 Australians were wounded. The Indonesian 440 Battalion had lost more than 30 men on a supply route. It had apparently considered secure enough to use repeatedly, eliminated by an enemy whose governments were simultaneously denying his presence in Kalimantan in every public forum available to them. The disproportion between the operational reality and the official position was total. Both continued simultaneously. 3 days after the second Sungai Coemba ambush, on the 15th of June, a platoon from A Company ambushed another substantial Indonesian force at Kindau, also in Kalimantan, and withdrew under artillery support when the Indonesians mounted a counterattack. Estimates of the Indonesian casualties at Kindau range from 25 to 50 killed. 2 more Australians were wounded in the engagement. This time, something in the secrecy apparatus developed a flaw that the apparatus had not been designed to handle. A journalist located one of the wounded Australians and conducted an interview. The story was published. The government maintained the position that the engagement had taken place on the Malaysian side of the border. The published account described fighting in Malaysia. The Australians had been in Kalimantan. The fiction held in print because there was no mechanism available to a civilian journalist in 1965 to disprove it from outside the classification barrier. The record does not note whether the journalist accepted the government's account or simply printed it because nothing else was available. The series of ambushes in May and June of 1965 changed the operational situation along the western Sarawak frontier in ways that Walker had anticipated when he designed the Claret strategy. The Indonesians could no longer use the Kalimantan border areas as a secure staging ground for operations into Malaysia. They did not know where the Commonwealth forces would strike next. They could not predict which supply routes were watched. They increasingly devoted their limited resources to protecting their own positions rather than planning offensive incursions into Malaysian territory. The initiative had been transferred without a single acknowledged engagement, which is precisely what the strategy had required. The 1st SAS Squadron had been conducting its own parallel program of operations throughout this period. Arriving in February, training for a month with British 22 SAS, beginning cross-border patrols in May. The SAS were authorized to operate further inside Indonesian territory than the infantry, eventually to 20,000 yards, more than 18 kilometers beyond the border, into a country the Australian government officially denied they had entered. Their patrols lasted between 2 and 89 days. 89 days. The men on that patrol spent nearly 3 months moving through Indonesian jungle, on no map that acknowledged their presence, under orders that would not be confirmed for 30 years. On the 25th of June, a squadron patrol led a Gurkha company to attack the village of Lumbus. On the 5th of July, another patrol killed at least 7 Indonesians in an ambush. Across the full deployment, more than 40 patrols on both sides of the border, 23 reconnaissance, 7 reconnaissance and ambush, 4 surveillance, 13 hearts and minds. The categories were recorded in the unit diary. The operations themselves were not publicly acknowledged until 1994. The war ended in Jakarta, not in Borneo. On the 30th of September, 1965, junior officers of the Indonesian army kidnapped and killed 6 senior generals in the capital. The coup failed militarily within hours, but its political consequences were catastrophic and irreversible. General Suharto, who had escaped the coup and led the military response, placed the blame on the Indonesian Communist Party. What followed was one of the largest episodes of mass killing in the 20th century. Estimates of the dead range from 500,000 to more than 1 million people. The PKI, once one of the world's largest communist parties outside the Soviet bloc in China, was destroyed as a political and organizational entity within months. Sukarno's political foundation, which had rested for years on the delicate balance between the army and the PKI as competing centers of power, collapsed with it. By March of 1966, Sukarno had signed the Super Semar document, transferring emergency executive powers to Suharto. He remained nominally president until 1967, a figure without authority in a government he no longer controlled. Konfrontasi, which had been his war and his personal policy, had become an embarrassment to the men who had replaced him. Suharto's priorities were internal stability and economic reconstruction. He had no interest in inheriting a war against Malaysia and the British Commonwealth. Indonesia rejoined the United Nations in April of 1966. On the 11th of August, 1966, the governments of Indonesia and Malaysia signed the Bangkok Accord. The war was formally over. Not 1 inch of Malaysian territory had been lost. The Federation had survived. Sarawak and Sabah remained Malaysian. The 4th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, had arrived in Sarawak in April of 1966 to relieve the 3rd Battalion and conducted its own operations as the peace talks progressed. Clashes with Indonesian regulars, cross-border patrols, the continuation of a war that was politically dying even as its soldiers still moved through its terrain. The last Australian casualties of the confrontation were 2 members of the 2nd SAS Squadron, missing and presumed drowned while crossing a swollen river near the campaign's end. Their bodies were not recovered. They were the last Australians lost in a war that officially had never fully existed. The soldiers came home. They had been ordered not to say what they had done. They complied. Operation Claret was not publicly acknowledged by Britain until 1974, 8 years after the operations concluded. The Australian government did not make its own formal acknowledgement until 1994, 30 years after the operations had begun. For those 3 decades, the men who had conducted them understood themselves to be under an obligation of silence that most of them honored even within their own families. Some honored it even within their own minds, in the way that men sometimes manage difficult knowledge by not returning to it unnecessarily. When researchers began interviewing veterans in the years after the Secrets Act expired, men said the same thing independently, with the quiet certainty of people correcting a record they had held privately for a long time. We were the only platoon that went over the border. Every platoon had said exactly this. Every platoon had crossed. The secrecy had been so architecturally complete that soldiers who served in the same battalion, conducting identical operations within days of each other, spent 30 years believing they were singular in what they had done. The wall between one platoon's operational knowledge and the next platoon's operational knowledge had held for 3 decades. That is a fact about the effectiveness of secrecy as a military instrument. It is also a precise measure of what was asked of the men who kept it, and what keeping it cost them in the particular loneliness of undisclosed experience. For Australian soldiers who conducted patrols in the Thai-Malay border region after the emergency's formal end in 1960, chasing MNLA remnants who had crossed into Thailand, operating in conditions identical to wartime operations. Those operations were not reclassified as warlike until 1995, 35 years after the patrols concluded. The category that was accurate under the relevant legislation was not accurate about the work that had been done. That formulation, which belongs to the record, is the appropriate one. The memorial shortfall is not an abstract grievance. A committee raising funds for an official commemoration of the Malaysian conflicts was, in the years before this script was researched, $1,000 short of the $60,000 needed to begin construction. After 50 years of waiting, the veterans were aging out of the time available to know whether the acknowledgement would arrive before they were no longer there to receive it. The stamp rejection is not a minor administrative matter. 37.5 millimeters by 26 millimeters. That was what Brian Selby and the men he served with asked for. A commemorative acknowledgement of service in one of Australia's only unambiguous military victories. Australia Post declined because the anniversary window had closed and the procedural rules did not accommodate the exception. Not 1 inch of territory was lost, and no one knows about it. The institutional confidence that those 2 victories produced in the Australian government was not, in isolation, irrational. The logic was straightforward, and the evidence for it appeared to be solid. Australia had fought a communist insurgency in Malaya across 12 years and won. It had fought an Indonesian hybrid war in Borneo across 4 years and won. Across 15 years and 2 distinct operational environments, Australian forces had demonstrated a sustained capacity for jungle counterinsurgency operations that was matched by almost no other military in the Western Alliance. The SAS had been forged in Borneo into a unit capable of operating for 89 consecutive days in enemy territory, without support or acknowledgement. The infantry had cleared a Malayan state in 18 months. The method appeared to work. The method appeared to be exportable. The lesson was not transferable, and the misapplication of it produced consequences that the men who carried the method could not have anticipated from inside their own success. The Malayan Emergency succeeded for reasons that were entirely specific to its particular context and did not generalize to other jungles, other populations, or other political conditions. The MNLA was ethnically isolated in a country whose Malay majority did not share its political aspirations and could not be recruited into its cause. It had no external state sponsor providing sustained military support. The British political commitment explicitly included the promise of Malayan independence, which removed the anti-colonial dimension that communist insurgencies require to generate broad popular support. The geography of the peninsula was containable, and the Briggs Plan's population control strategy was executable at a scale that produced genuine results. These conditions were products of what Malaya specifically was. They were not products of what counterinsurgency as a method could achieve in any jungle, against any enemy, within any political structure. The Australian SAS carried to Vietnam what was genuinely transferable from Borneo and applied it with extraordinary effectiveness. In Vietnam, their reputation produced the name the Viet Cong gave them. Ma Rung, Phantoms of the Jungle. Across more than 1,400 patrols, they reported the movements of more than 5,600 enemy troops and killed more than 500 in 298 contacts. At the patrol level, the 4-man or 6-man team moving through contested terrain on specific intelligence, avoiding contact until the moment of their choosing, Borneo had prepared them as thoroughly as any operational experience could have done. That was the genuine and transferable lesson, and it was applied correctly. The strategic confidence was the lesson incorrectly applied. The government-level conviction that what Australia had achieved in Malaya and Borneo could be reproduced at the scale and under the political conditions of Vietnam was the error. Vietnam had a majority population whose nationalist aspirations aligned with the communist movement fighting the war. It had external state sponsors, North Vietnam, the Soviet Union, and China, providing sustained military and material support at a level that the Malayan Emergency's MNLA had never come close to possessing. The geography could not be managed through population relocation because the population was not the enemy's support base in the same structural way. The distinction between a technique and a theory is not always visible from inside a success, and 2 complete jungle victories had made the technique look like a theory. The wins were real. The conclusions exceeded what the wins had actually established. Both things are in the record, and both things matter. A particular quality attaches to victories that no one reports while they are happening. They disappear not through active suppression, but through structural absence. No photographs in newspapers, no dispatches from correspondents, no official ceremonies in capital cities, no naming of streets or inscriptions on public buildings, no moment of visible sacrifice that the commemorative culture can attach itself to and carry forward. The emergency and the confrontation produced no Kokoda track, no Gallipoli, no event of sufficient public visibility to become part of what the country understands itself to have done. What they produced was operational success in conditions of deliberate obscurity. The success was real. The obscurity consumed it. A national commemorative culture that turned its attention to the loud wars and looked away from the quiet ones did not do this through malice or through conspiracy. It did it through the same structural logic that the Claret operations had themselves required to function. What is classified cannot be reported. What is not reported cannot become public memory. What does not become public memory does not become commemoration. What is not commemorated does not enter the national sense of what has been done in the country's name. The men kept the secret because they were ordered to. The country then kept it for them because it had no access to the information that would have made commemoration possible. The architecture of the forgetting was built directly from the architecture of the operational secrecy that had preceded it. One produced the other, and the men who had generated the victory paid the cost of both. If you had a family member who served in Malaya, in Borneo, on the Thai-Malay border, in any of the operations that never entered a newspaper while they were happening, whose service produced no public acknowledgement for decades, whose medals did not come until long after they had earned them, who said nothing because they had been ordered to say nothing, and then found that the habit of silence outlasted the orders and the formal obligation alike, say so in the comments. This history belongs to the people who carried it, not to the governments that classified it. Brian Selby's words are the most accurate thing available about what happened in those jungles between 1950 and 1966. One of only 2 post-World War campaigns Australia has been involved with that were complete successes. Not 1 inch of territory was lost, and no one knows about it. The stamp application was rejected. The question is whether the country is now paying attention.